Chapter 21. A kind of royal wedding. Reyes! The cry penetrated the air. Reyes struggled his way through to consciousness. For the last week or so he had been on the move almost constantly. He had gone to bed early last night and his body had been so tired that he had fallen asleep almost the second he had put the plate with the chicken bones down on the wooden floor. And now it was morning, and judging by the amount of light that was flooding in through the windows, he had slept through until quite late. Reyes! The shout repeated. It was coming from outside the room, somewhere. Most likely someone was in the courtyard. Are you still up there? Reyes was huddled up under the blankets, not wanting to move because he could sense just how cold the air was. His stomach was telling him that he was hungry again, and his throat insisted that he should find something to drink. He looked longingly at the plate on which the bones of the chicken still sat. Maybe if he tried to pick the bones clean, he might get something off of them. He felt that it would make more sense for him to get up and rustle something new to eat. Even if he did manage to get a little bit of meat off the bones, it wouldn't be enough to sustain him. On the off chance that someone had left something on the table during the night, he lifted his head just enough to look. There was a glass of water sitting on the table, but no food. Reyes assumed the water had probably been left there last night when the chicken had been brought up, and he had been too hungry for the food to notice. Reyes! The voice repeated. It sounded quite insistent, almost frantic. Yeah, Reyes called back tiredly and maybe a little irritably. I'm here. Well, come on then, I'm waiting for you, the voice replied. Reyes shivered at the thought of getting out of the nice warm bed, but it was something he was going to have to do sooner or later anyway. Hesitantly, he threw back the blankets and exposed his naked body to the cold chill in the air. His instincts yelled at him to keep warm, to pull the blanket back over him, but he resisted. Give it a minute, he muttered to himself unconvincingly. Reyes had been out in the ice and snow for quite a long time yesterday. If anything, the weather had been much worse then, and he hadn't been wearing anything then either. It was the sudden shock of moving from the toasty warm bed to the icy cold room that gave him so much pause. You don't want to be late, the voice called. Come on, it'll be lunchtime soon. Lunchtime, Reyes thought to himself. No wonder he was feeling so hungry again. Okay, I'm coming. Reyes shivered and climbed slowly to his feet. At least he could answer his thirst now. He walked over to the table to take the glass. The glass was cold, chilled by the atmosphere. Reyes didn't care. It had been a long time since he'd last had anything to drink, and he downed the contents in one gulp. Placing the glass back on the small table, Reyes turned and stepped through the windows of the room and onto the remains of the rickety old balcony. The balcony creaked a little under his light frame, and Reyes felt a little uncertain that it would hold him. Standing in the middle of the courtyard, looking up at Reyes and waiting patiently for the harpy to join him, was King Goatee. It had been the king who had been calling for him. Didn't the king have servants to do that sort of thing for him? King Goatee was keeping himself warm by standing close to a fire that Reyes had seen his bodyguards start to build last night. Quinnigoth and Tanagi were also down there. Reyes had no doubt that they had been relieved by Heshgoth and whoever she had chosen as her second to watch over him during the night, and they in turn had been relieved by Quinnigoth and Tanagi again, and he had slept through all of it. The king was standing within a sword arm's length of the two harpies. It was hard to believe that this was the same king who, before he had gotten engaged to Jenny, would probably have killed harpies on sight, and here he was, standing in easy reach of two harpies who within the last week had held that same king prisoner and had actually threatened his life. How the world has changed, Reyes commented to himself. The king was looking up at the balcony expectantly. He was carrying something in his arms. Reyes wasn't too sure what it was at first. A coat or a cloak, perhaps? It was probably the item that Jenny had mentioned in her letter, although it didn't really look like a suitable garment for a harpy to wear. By what it could see of it from the balcony, it was made from black leather with a few splashes of white here and there to decorate it. Reyes would have to admit it seemed to be an ideal match for the skirt he had been left. The skirt! Jenny wasn't going to be too happy if he didn't put the skirt on. After all the trouble she had been to preparing it for him, he paused. I'll be back in a minute, he shouted down to the king, and then ducked back into the room to find it. Reyes? The king shouted, concerned. I'll be right back out. I just need to find something, Reyes shouted back. It wasn't hard to find the skirt. There wasn't a lot of stuff in the room to search. Since it clearly wasn't on the table, it pretty much had to be over on the bed somewhere. More accurately, he found it buried under the blankets he had pushed aside that morning during the act of getting up. Come on, Reyes, the king called again. Your sister will have my hide if we're late. "Come in," Race called back. He stepped out onto the balcony again, fastening the skirt about him as he did so. And then he unfurled his wings to their fully majestic length and jumped from the rickety balcony before it decided to collapse under him. Race landed in front of the king and almost immediately dropped to his knees, addressing him, "My liege." He wasn't blind to the fact that the two harpies hovering close by the fire had subtly placed themselves on either side of the king, boxing him in. "Get up, my brother," the king instructed. "You don't need to kneel before me. You don't need to stand on any kind of ceremony with me. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here. Come, we are late. I assume you can walk a short distance." "If I have to," Race replied. "Good," the king said. "Then put this on." He handed a leather cloak to Race. "I can't wear this," Race replied. "My wings will get in the way." And the king silenced him and unfolded the cloak. "Stand still. I'll put it on you." "But," Race said. The king moved fairly slowly. It seemed he was only too aware of the way Race's bodyguards were watching him. The cloak had been carefully designed with the harpy in mind. There were two slots in the cloak, positioned so that the part of Race's wings that poked out above his shoulders would stick easily through them, and allow the rest of the cloak to drape and easily spread itself over the rest of his wings. "Your sister came up with the idea. Gaggara has one just like it. She used Gaggara as a kind of experiment to see how it would look. Now, you just tie the thing around your neck like a normal cloak, and we can leave." "Feels a little awkward," Race said. He didn't mention that the leather felt icy cold against his skin. He assumed that, given time, his own body heat would fix that. "It looks great," the king replied. "You'll get used to it." "Well, I can't fly with this on. I hope we don't have far to walk," Race commented. He finished tying the cloak into place. "Not far," the king assured him. "Let's go. They'll be waiting for us." Race nodded and smiled. "Any idea what this is all about? Or did my sister hide that from you as well?" King Goatee didn't reply immediately. Instead, he started to lead the way out of the courtyard, walking slowly so that Race could keep up. This relatively slow pace also allowed the two of them to chat fairly easily. Quinnigoff and Tenegi fell in line, following closely behind. Race wouldn't be surprised if they were both watching the king like a hawk. "The way I understand it," the king commented, "there's going to be a kind of royal wedding." "Really?" Race said happily, following the king eagerly. "I know I said I wanted to be at your wedding, but I didn't expect you to redo it just so I could be present. Or is it your wedding day was ruined by the machinations of the evil Clamper? Well, whatever the reason, congratulations. I'm glad that this time I'll be there." No," the king commented. "It's not actually me and Jenny that are getting married." The king turned left once he had stepped beyond the confines of the courtyard. "Although one day I think Daffodil would like us to renew our vows in the great temple again, in order to make it a totally unsullied day. Clamper really did ruin things for us." "So whose wedding then? Has Princess Alice found someone? Did she recover from the enchanted food yet?" Actually, it seemed a little soon. Race doubted that Mangloss could have come up with a cure for that kind of enchantment yet. The king shook his head. "To be honest, I think Princess Alice did find someone a long time ago, who she fell in love with almost immediately. Unfortunately, he turned out to be a harpy, who, what was more, he's spoken for." "Me, you mean?" Race said. "Well, I can't be certain," the king said. "She never said anything. But she gave you a few very meaningful looks back during that engagement party, and when you were taken into custody, she spent the rest of the evening and most of the following day crying." "I'm sorry," Ray said. "Oh, I think she got over you," the king said, "but she hasn't found anyone else. Besides, she is still under the influence of that sausage she ate. I'm afraid she won't even be at the wedding." "That is a shame," Ray commented sincerely. "I'm sure Wranglers will find a cure for her soon." "I hope so," the king replied. "So," Race considered, "if it's not you or your sister, it can't be my brother. He's already married. Please go on. Not me, not S, not your brother. Who else?" "What about Manipul? I thought he was already married, but it's not Duke Ganespa, no," the king commented. Race shrugged his shoulders. "I have no idea then. Who's left?" Actually, Race had a very strong suspicion as to who the king was hinting at. He had suspected this since before seeing the note last night, unless the king was willing to come right out and say who, though. Race was more than happy to just play along. Besides, there was one thing that had made Race doubt that he was right. The king had referred to it as a royal wedding. "Like I said, it's a kind of royal wedding," the king repeated. "You see, at the moment, this encampment of ours is home to every free human left in the land of Floreth. I've yet to take a complete census. but I believe there may be as many as 100,000 all inside 300 acres of what was once forest and farmland. More recently it has become home to a village of harpies who are all willing to aid us in our attempt to liberate the land. Race nodded. So why royal? Kind of royal, the king said, when it's the leader and the chief of the harpies who are getting married. Race grinned. He'd been right. It felt typical of his sister to pull something like this, arranging a marriage behind his back and not even telling him until the very day he was due to tie the knot. I don't feel very royal. Ever since I knighted you, you are a noble of the realm. You are the son of a duke, albeit adopted, and you are the chief of a harpy village. Some might even say that you are the equivalent of a king of the harpies. You don't get much more royal than king, trust me. Race shook his head. So, how did my sister convince Gaggara that we should get married once I returned from Golspot? Race had always hoped that he and Gaggara might marry one day, but this all seemed so sudden. It wasn't difficult. She loves you, the king replied. The only thing that had held you and her back in the past was that she refused to get married unless she could be herself at the wedding. That is no longer a problem. Most of the population are willing to accept you at face value, and Jenny felt that a wedding between the leader and the chief of harpies could only improve morale. Oh? Race asked. Think about it. Harpies don't usually marry. Few people even seem to realise that there is such a thing as a male harpy for a female to marry in the first place. Then these harpies appear and offer aid to us in our fight against the elves. Among the more ignorant present, that can only raise questions. Why are harpies helping us, and what do they expect in return? Race nodded. I just want to be with my family. I know, the king agreed, and you'll have your own family soon, Gaggara. But you'll have to look at it with the mind of a peasant, one who doesn't even know you exist. Race nodded. Now, imagine how much of a relief it is to hear about the marriage of two harpies, especially when it's raised to the spectacle of a royal wedding. The people begin to learn about you, they find out who you are. What is more, the fact that you are so willing to adopt one of humanity's more sacred institutions and actually marry another member of your own race, it can only be good for morale, Race agreed. Exactly, the king stated. Although between you and me, I think that your sister does have another reason for wanting to see the two of you get married as soon as possible. Oh? Race gave the king a look that told him he expected the king to elaborate. You've been running a lot of errands recently, putting yourself in a lot of danger. I think I speak for both of us when I say that we appreciate all you've done for us over the last few weeks. Daffodil is scared that something will happen to you. She is scared that your child, who will after all be her niece or nephew, might be born out of wedlock. So she wants to marry me off as soon as she can for the sake of my unborn child, Race joked. That sounds like Jenny. You know your sister, the king commented. Horse and tiger, Race mimicked. Do I know my sister? The king laughed. The peasants of the encampment had made this place as much like their home as they could. There were signs everywhere demarking where one village began and another ended. They made their way slowly through several of these little communities in the general direction of a large white pavilion. People who were active in the village often came out to cheer, but whether they were cheering Race and wishing him luck in his marriage, or whether it was the presence of the king that made them act so, was never all that clear. Can I ask, Race said, will there be food at this wedding? He could feel his stomach grumbling. I believe we have quite a spread prepared, the king acknowledged. Why? I'm just worried about food, Race said. If the elves are truly closing in on us to the effect that no one can leave the encampment to hunt, do we have enough food to see us through? Are we going to have to ration the food out? Nothing is going to grow in this soil, at least not during such a harsh winter. Our soldiers, and those peasants we're training to fight, will need a good meal every day to keep their strength up. Yet I don't like the idea of anyone having to go without. And you harpies eat so much, the king commented. Don't worry about it. I put the same question to Mangloss when he closed the gates. Mangloss assures me we have enough food inside the encampment to feed everyone here for close to a year, and hopefully we aren't going to be here that long. He tells me he's more concerned with the water supply, though he did say that if it keeps snowing the way it has for the last few days, it shouldn't be a problem. I'm glad to hear it, Race said. I have to admit I'm feeling quite hungry. I've had no breakfast yet today. There was no church or temple inside the encampment, but there were a number of small buildings that had been converted for the purpose of worship. Most of the time these buildings actually served as the homes of the priests that had managed to take refuge with the rest of the population of the Moth. When they held their sermons, they did so in front of the building, in a small area put aside especially for such gatherings. One such building in particular sat in the middle of a cluster of houses in which lived the population from the village of Bright Forest. It stood out because the priest of the village had erected a large pavilion to protect his congregation from the weather, whether it was sun or snow. It could be seen from halfway across the encampment and had become the most popular place of worship inside the encampment, a kind of pseudo-great temple. It was towards this large pavilion that the king was leading Reyes. It seemed that even a wedding between a pair of harpies was going to be quite a spectacle. The pavilion was surrounded by peasants. It was a large crowd, totally encompassing the huge white structure and the priest's home. Soldiers had been brought in to keep the crowd under control. Reyes and the king were going to have to make their way through the crowd to get to the pavilion. "You know," Reyes commented, "if it wasn't for this cloak, I could just fly over their heads." "I'd still have to make my way through," the king replied. "Besides, I don't feel that would look very respectful to the gods." "I don't see why not," Reyes replied. Then he turned his attention to Tanegi and Quinagoff. "I want you two to make us a path through the crowd. Don't hurt anyone and don't harry anyone. Let them move of their own volition. Just make sure they know we need to get through." "Right, boss," Tanegi commented, and then she and Quinagoff stepped around Reyes and the king and approached the crowd of peasants. Reyes could almost see a mental image of his two bodyguards shuffling their sleeves up their arms as they approached the peasants. He hoped there wouldn't be any trouble. "Is that wise?" the king asked. "I hope so," Reyes replied. Tanegi and Quinagoff didn't have a lot of convincing to do. The peasants, upon seeing the two harpies approach them, were only too happy to make room for the groom and his escort to pass by unhindered. As Reyes and the king made their way along the newly forming path, other peasants closed in the gap behind them, and some tried to follow them to the front of the crowd, taking advantage of the situation to get themselves a better position. Once the pair were through the crowd, the soldiers broke ranks enough to let them into the sacred area of worship, and then closed up behind them to prevent any peasants from following them through the gap. Now they were at the pavilion itself. It was orientated in such a way that they actually emerged at the front left corner of the pavilion instead of the central rear, which was where he was expected to go. The king continued to lead the way round to the starting point of Reyes' marriage. Reyes took the opportunity to see who was among the guests. Greyforth sat at the front of the pavilion, which made Reyes feel a little more relaxed. It was good to see his brother safe and inside the encampment. Clearly Mangloss must have fetched him in last night, just as he had promised. Greyforth sat with Alicia and his two children. Just behind them was Sir Grant and his daughter Anida. Behind them, going all the way to the back of the pavilion, were several other knights of the realm. There wasn't enough room under the pavilion for all the knights in the encampment and their families to attend, but Reyes judged that the cream of the crop were here. In particular, he recognised the faces of Sir Duncan and Sir Fawkes, as well as Duke Ganespa and his wife and children. Mangloss was also there, though, as a peasant, he was relegated to the very back. Perhaps strange for a harpy wedding. There were no harpy guests. Well, not exactly no harpy guests. Quinagoff and Tanegi took up positions at the very rear of the pavilion. From there they could watch the wedding and also watch over their ward. Reyes wasn't sure they would count as guests, but he was happy to see that harpies had some representation other than just the bride and groom. Jenny and Gaggara were standing at the back of the pavilion, waiting. Gaggara looked beautiful. She was wearing a skirt and cloak very similar to those that Reyes was wearing, and somehow they emphasised the curves of both her wings and her body. "Oh, one more thing," the king said. "I'm afraid Sir Richmond isn't here. He couldn't make it. He sends his best wishes, though." "I understand," Reyes said and nodded. "He's still somewhere in the Elven Empire, I assume." The king concurred. According to Mangloss, Sir Richmond is keeping a low profile after the assassination of the Elf Emperor. Apparently your source was correct. "Sir Richmond did a good job," Reyes replied. "Sir Richmond claims that he didn't do it," the king said. "He doesn't know who did. But the coincidental disappearance of the Mage Advisor does make for a most likely suspect." "Darty," Reyes commented, surprised. "Was that his name?" the king asked. Reyes nodded. "I find it easy to believe that Darty might have lost his temper with the Emperor. We mustn't jump to conclusions, though. When did Sir Richmond say he'd be back?" "He didn't," the king replied. "At least, Mangloss didn't tell me. Sir Richmond just wanted you to know that he would have been here if he could." They reached the rear of the pavilion. Reyes smiled at Gaggara and received one of her cute smiles back. "Are you two ready?" Jenny asked. "I guess so," Reyes replied. He looked at the walkway through the middle of the pavilion to the priest who was standing at the very front. The priest was surrounded by a large sculptured pantheon of gods. On the left side was the bust of the goddess of love, while across the way on the right sat a small statue of the god of truth. The two statues didn't match, but the priest was clearly trying to work with what he had. Behind him were statues, busts, and in some cases even wood carvings of every other god and goddess that held some office in the human pantheon. There wasn't really enough room for all of them under the cover of the pavilion, and so some were getting snowed on. Among this wide selection of gods and goddesses sat one goddess carved from wood that wouldn't have been recognised by any human priest. This goddess bore a tail and a beautiful set of wings, and had evidently been added in deference to the fact that it was harpies getting married. Supposedly, it represented Lamawalt the Eternal. "Good," Jenny said, offering her hand to the king. "Give us a minute to go and find our seats, then it's all up to you." Rose watched as the king and Jenny made their way to the front of the pavilion and found seats next to Greyforth and his family. The king then glanced back towards Race, as if trying to egg him on. Race nodded towards the king, and then he looked deeply into Gaggara's eyes. "I love you." "I love you too," Gaggara replied happily. Race offered his hand to his bride and said, "Let's go and get married."